Hi there, everyone. It's 1 o'clock on the West Coast, and we welcome you to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, our live and interactive weekly show focused on governmental relations here in California. And today we're going to talk some federal education topics as well. I'm Naj Alikan, ACSA Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. My co-host, Edgar Zazweta, ACSA Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations. Edgar is clearly coming in from his second studio because he gets multiple studios, but I assume you were only watering the plants in there.
I actually had to come into my office. I can't, it's no substitute to your classroom there. So, but I did have to actually interact with some folks, did have my mask. So, keeping it safe here. So a little change of scenery. I do miss the home office today, but sometimes we have to be nimble, right? So
hey, as long as
I have to connect with you regardless of the location.
I was going to say, you and I have spent multiple hours on meetings today, none of which did we actually really get to converse, which is totally different because when we're in the office, right, you and I see each other almost every day and get a chance to talk. My only prerequisite for you being in the office today is I'm hoping you don't need a hanger to be able to have the decent internet signal.
We'll see how the ACSA Wi-Fi holds up. And as Michael mentioned to us, I promise I didn't go to the office just to stay away from my son, Nico. That was not the goal today, but he will be missed.
Well, folks, live and interactive, we welcome your questions and your comments on our show today. We're going to be talking about what's happening on the Hill with federal education funding. Go ahead, say hello from wherever you're watching our show today. Again, we welcome your questions and comments. Edgar, before we start talking about what's happening in D.C., let's talk about the latest that's happening here in the state with school reopening.
Yeah, still continue to be the topic of the week, of the month, of the last 5 months. Obviously, our folks, our members are living this day by day, folks ramping up to distance learning, talking a lot about professional development. I think the one outstanding issue from the guidance from a couple weeks ago that we're still waiting for more details is this whole notion of a waiver, right? And folks have heard this story from us before, but we're still anticipating a little bit more details in terms of what that waiver is going to entail. Just to remind our viewers, as part of the governor's revised reopening guidance, there was a provision there that gave a waiver for elementary schools to still open for in-person instruction, even if they reside in a county that's on the state monitoring list. And essentially the rules dictate that they will not be able to reopen. It is giving a pathway for some of those folks potentially, and that's a big potentially, to reopen. There's a few criteria there in terms of consulting with your labor partners, with your parent groups. So I know a lot of our folks are just anxious to see what are those details going to look like, what's going to be possible. One big question that we get, and we were meeting with Linda Darling Hammond, president of the state board, chief advisor to the governor on a lot of education issues a couple of days ago. We asked some questions about small groups. So we've gotten the question, can I bring small groups, whether it be students with disabilities or other targeted groups that distance learning may not make sense? And it was relayed to us that the intent definitely is that we can have small cohorts, with the caveat, as almost everything in this situation, that we work directly with our county health officer in our respective county.
Is it, I want to ask, because we've dealt so much with waivers, and I just want to get your assessment on it right now, because as schools and school districts are putting together their reopening plan, and we know that so many are already moving to distance learning or already have moved to distance learning to start the fall. Do you feel like there's a growing number of parents out there, of guardians out there that are looking at this waiver as a benefit specifically to their students?
Yeah, I think that there is some questions there. And one of the things that's been reported on, and frankly, I think it's something that we need to think about from a policy standpoint. There's been a lot of reporting on whether maybe private schools or charter schools or other types of schools, are they in a better position to access these waivers? And I think that the clear answer there is, from a technical standpoint, everybody's in the same playing field. Now, whether those schools, whether it be a private school or charter school, will be able to get support from their labor partner. In most cases, they won't have labor partners. So how are they engaging their employees? How are they engaging their parents? But I do think that that's something that our folks are concerned about. And forget the private and the charter school component, that there's a lot of parents out there who are looking for an in-person instruction option, right? And what is this situation about allowing some schools to open but not others? How is that going to impact some of the attendance patterns and just dictate some of the requests that our school leaders are getting in terms of parents shopping around, frankly? Is there an option for them to get their kids in actual classroom?
And while we're here, we want to say hello to our former ACSA president, Holly Eads, also Gary and Terry and Derek and Amy. Derek, just a recent winner of a big major award as well. So good to have all of you on our show today. All right, so that's the rundown of what's happening here in the state. So let's talk about what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now. Joining us today is Alex Perry from Foresight Law and Policy. He is our D.C. insider. And for those of you who are not familiar with ACSA's work on the federal level, Foresight Law and Policy has been our federal advocate for more than 5 years in Washington. And Alex we're honored to have you here with us today, Alex. Let me just start really quickly with this. We've heard some details about this new stimulus package. Some people are saying this may be the last federal stimulus package that we get.
Yeah.
So give us some details on the package and pots of money right now for public education.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to your audience. But yeah, we are now in the middle of a debate about the next and probably what will be, as you say, the last anticipated major stimulus proposal to respond to COVID-19. The previous large one, the CARES Act, was passed in March. That was about $3.5 trillion worth of funding. We're not expecting the next package to be nearly so large on an aggregate level, but we are actually expecting there to be more money for public education as part of that. But there are lots of details still to sort out and lots of disagreements, particularly between Democrats and Republicans over what that should look like. So I'm sure your audience may have seen over the last few days, there's been a lot of discussion about a bill that was released by Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans. That bill is an agreement between Senate Republicans and the White House. But it's important to note that in order for a law to get signed by the president, it is going to also need to get passed by the Democratic House. And so we are still in the positioning phase between the different parties over what a final deal could look like. So we have two different competing proposals right now. One from House Democrats, which was passed in May of this year, the HEROES Act. That provided about $100 billion in funding for education, ends up being around $68 billion-ish for K-12 education specifically. And then the one that's being talked about right now is this Republican proposal that's been released in the last couple of days. Also around $100 billion for education. It's $105 billion in this case, about $70 billion of that for K-12 education. However, what the Republican proposal is asking is basically it takes that $70 billion. Now, just to give you a comparison, the CARES Act that was passed in March provided only about $13 billion for K-12 education as a whole. So we are talking about quite a significantly larger pot of money, but the Senate Republican proposal places a big conditioning on that, which is, first of all, okay, take the $70 billion. First of all, they take $10 billion out of that pot. That $10 billion would be for non-public schools, so for private schools. And then of the $60 billion that remain, 1/3 of that fund, so it's about nearly $20 billion, would be made available immediately to all school districts on the same formula as the CARES Act funding was made available, which is the Title I formula. But the remaining 2/3 of money is only available to school districts that have some kind of reopening. Now, to in-person instruction. Now, the way that the Senate Republicans are currently defining that is that if school districts are offering in-person instruction instruction for 50% of students for 50% of the school year, such that any student attending that school is in person in the school for 50% of the time, that school district would automatically get money, and then it's basically graded from there down to no in-person instruction. And at the no in-person instruction level, the school districts are frozen out of money from that pot. Now, that is considered to be a non-starter for many Democrats. And to take me right back to my initial point, in order for this bill to reach the president's desk, it is going to require Democratic support. Now, this is going to be a really, really tough bill to negotiate. We've already seen it's been really difficult for Senate Republicans and the White House, which is also under Republican control, to reach agreement on what the details of this package looks like. The negotiations that have taken place over the last 2 days between the White House, between Majority Leader McConnell, and now between the Democratic leaders, House Democratic Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, have not yielded much progress as far as we've been able to tell. They are really, really far apart. And I think part of the reason why people say this will be the last stimulus package is because of quite how difficult they're anticipating these negotiations will be, that there's just not going to be an appetite to return to this again.
Alex, so obviously California being in the midst of this reopening fight, and we saw just over the last number of weeks how so many of these issues were politicized. Given when the president had, some public sentiments in terms of the schools, and was even commenting on what was happening here in California, in Los Angeles, and San Diego. So, given the information you just gave about the perspective of trying to really incentivize reopening schools here in California, I think we're up to more than 85% of our school districts are starting in distance learning. And we're not sure what the outlook is going to be of whether these schools are going to be able to open. Now, on the political front, given the California delegation, given how many representatives we have out there, I know it's always dangerous to try to project what may or may not happen, and we promise we won't send you the recording if you get this wrong. But what do you anticipate on some of these issues in terms of how this plays out? In terms of the issue of the incentives or making sure that schools are open in terms of being able to access funds.
Right. So let's start with what everybody agrees on. Everybody agrees, and by everybody, I mean Democrats and Republicans agree, that more money for public education is essential. That there is a broad recognition that the costs involved in reopening schools, but the costs involved in just continuing to offer services, even if it's in a remote learning environment, are significant, that there are massive costs involved for school districts ahead. And so we've heard it from Democrats, we've heard it from Majority Leader McConnell, we've also heard it from Lamar Alexander, who's the chairman of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, the relevant education authorizing committee in the Senate. Everybody agrees that more money is necessary. And you may have also noticed those numbers I talked about in both of the packages, the aggregate numbers, very, very similar. We're looking at roughly $100 billion in the House Democratic bill, roughly $100 billion in the Senate Republican bill. So I think there is some agreement there. Now, you've identified, though, I think, where the big sticking point's going to be, which is this question about how much of that money is conditioned on reopening, if any at all. Now, senior Democrats have said it's a non-starter that any of the money is conditioned on reopening, but they only control one of the three relevant bodies that needs to be involved in this conversation, the House. They don't control the Senate, they don't control the White House. And so ultimately there is going to need to be a negotiation and a back and forth here to figure out, how do we do this? And you could theoretically see a world in which there is some kind of mechanism to incentivize schools to reopen. Certainly, I would imagine nothing as aggressive as the Senate Republican proposal, where 1/3 of the money, where a full 2/3 of the money is only available for school districts that are offering in-person instruction. But and I think this is why, I keep coming back to how difficult this is for many of the actors who are negotiating this, and how difficult I think it's going to be to get a final package, is there really is, so far, nobody has yet presented a compromise proposal that we've seen or heard of that is going to be acceptable to all parties. You have still the White House and Senate Republicans on one hand saying very, very strongly in-person instruction must start up again. And you have Democrats on the other side saying that that's much too risky, much too dangerous, and preferring instead that those decisions be much more in the hands of state and local actors. So that was a very, very long way of saying I don't have a great answer to your question. But unfortunately, that's the reality we're dealing with.
Fair enough.
All right. Well, then, Alex, let's see if you can come up with a good answer for this question. Lawmakers have agreed to hold districts harmless as far as their budgets are concerned here in California. And I think you could debate on what hold harmless really means. But really, the discussion now among education leaders is about 2021, 2022, and budget cuts and kicking the can down the road as far as how that ends up saddling students with debt as the school years move forward. The question now is that a discussion you're hearing about on the Hill? Is California only driving that, or are we hearing other states talk about that same thing?
Yeah, this is a massive conversation taking place in states across the country. I mean, many states have prefaced their education funding on tax revenue generated from economic activity that has not been taken place because of lockdowns, because of social distancing, because we're just trying to do our best to get our way through the health crisis. So there are many states that are in some cases very scary budget situations as it relates to their education budgets. There are some states where maybe they set it up so it was tied to lottery funding, and lottery funding tends to be a bit more resistant to some of the kind of swings back and forth of how the economy is doing. But there are many states where there are big budget issues coming down the pike. And just like California, many of them have sort of made the decision not to make a decision this budget year, and in many cases, sort of push that forward to the next budget year. As part of these stimulus conversations that are taking place on Capitol Hill, there are sort of two components to that public finance conversation. On the one hand, you have the pure education conversation. How much money is being made available for K-12? How much money is being made available for higher education that goes directly to school districts or colleges in order to help them cover their costs? But there's also this other big conversation that's taking place as well, which is so tied into that, which is the federal government willing to offer any support to state and local budgets? Not education specific, but if the federal government is not in a position to provide additional funding to state and local budgets, then those states are going to have to cut their budgets. And we know that's going to have an impact on education as a result. And again, this is another area where there is quite a significant disagreement between Democrats in the House and between Republicans in the Senate. The HEROES Act, the House Democrat bill that was passed in May, has a significant investment. It's over $1 trillion in funding for state and local budgets. The Senate Republican proposal has nothing. There's no additional funding for state and local budgets. And so that's another of these dynamics that's going to play itself out that we as folks in the education space are going to want to be really watchful of. I think the other point to say that could potentially insulate this slightly is that within the proposals that we have seen, there are what quote unquote maintenance of effort requirements. So the federal government is basically saying to states, look, we are providing you with, in some cases, a significant investment in public education in your state. Our ask of you and our requirement of you taking this money is that you maintain your existing budget investments at the state level in education, that this funding is, doesn't end up basically getting taken away by cuts. Now, there are different ways you can construct a maintenance of effort requirement, and the Senate Republican version is quite a bit weaker than the House Democratic version. But there are lots of moving pieces here. And I think, we're obviously very, very focused on that conversation around exactly how much money is available for public education as pure education money. But we also need to be paying attention to that wider conversation around what's being done to help support state and local budgets as well, because what happens on that side, on the state and local budget side, will automatically have a big impact on education budgets nationwide.
Alex, we got a question from one of our leaders and very loyal viewers. We have to point that out, Holly Heats, who joins us almost every week. So she asked about an issue that's hot here in California as well, in terms of liability language and really trying to protect schools in this case. If we're trying to open up, but then they have to inherit some of that liability should somebody get sick, folks are really concerned about this issue. What's the prospects of this piece?
Yeah, so I think the prospects for there being some kind of federal liability protection language for schools are actually quite good as part of a package. So with the caveat that it requires a package to actually be negotiated, which, let's take as read all of the challenges that I've talked about. I still believe that there will be a package, that a deal will be done. I think it's just going to end up being much more difficult than anyone had really anticipated it would be, even a week, 2 weeks ago, when we were talking about the end of July being used to negotiate this package. But the Senate Republican proposal does have quite robust liability protection language in it that's inclusive of all kinds of local government actors, including school districts, basically any sort of public entity. Effectively, what the language does is it makes COVID-19 liability claims a federal court's issue, and effectively provides liability for any actor who is abiding by local health guidelines. So whatever the health guidelines are in the jurisdiction that you're operating in, if it's masks must be worn indoors, if it's social distancing, if it's certain kind of cleaning regimens, as long as the public entity is following whatever those local guidelines are, the liability protection is offered. Liability protection is a massive, massive, massive priority for Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and is also a priority for Lamar Alexander, the chairman of the Senate Help Committee. And so if I were a betting man, I would say that one of the things, so on the other hand, the House Democratic bill does not have any liability protection language in it. I would anticipate that one of those areas of negotiation of you give me something that I want and I'll give you something that you want is going to be on the Republican side. They will not, I can't foresee a scenario in which McConnell allows a package to pass the Senate that doesn't have liability protection in it. I mean, I think they may end up tweaking the language a bit to try and draw the line more strongly between, folks who are playing by the rules and find themselves running afoul of liability protections versus true bad actors who are trying to use liability protections as a shield against being a bad actor. But my expectation is that there's a high likelihood that a final package will have liability relief in it, and that relief will extend to K-12 as well.
And folks, we want to remind you, Alex is with us for a few more minutes. So if you have any more federal questions, definitely send them our way. Gary Reller asks a question, Alex, and I think you answered part of it in your last response to Edgar's question. But I do think that there's something important to it about how long you think it's going to take for some type of federal agreement. And I ask that not just because of Gary's question, but there's a finite amount of time that something has to be done here. Do you foresee any piece of this hitting that threshold, that deadline to which it pushes and keeps lawmakers in DC to get it figured out?
Yeah, theoretically. So there are a few kind of forcing points right now. One, this Friday is the expiration date for the extended unemployment insurance. That's the extra $600 in federal unemployment insurance. It's also the expiration of the federal ban on evictions. And then we're also bumping right up against the traditional August recess where Congress leaves town for the month of August. They've done that for as long as there's been a Congress, and then pop back in September. So there is a lot of pressure here to get something done. However, We have heard rumblings about the possibility of a short-term extension of unemployment protections, maybe a 4 to 6 week extension that could push it into September, so that potentially a deal, may not get done until September. There is Congress is very good at building deadlines, but it's also very good at then finding a way to skirt around a deadline without dealing with the problem. And it is also, unfortunately, a possibility that happens here. Now, I don't think it's a high likelihood. I think the smart prognostication continues to say that some kind of deal within the next 2 to 3 weeks is more likely than not. But given the huge challenges that there have been, even between getting Senate Republicans and the White House to agree on this, you have to think that there is some small chance, some small world where a deal is not possible or doesn't end up materializing until September. I mean, I think the smart money is still on at some point before the middle of August, but we have to entertain the possibility that these negotiations are going to take longer, because this is your United States Congress, and if there's one thing that they struggle at, it's coming to a deal.
Thanks, Alex. And obviously it's an election year, and we're all trying to see what's going to happen here in the next few months. And I know a lot of this is going to be dictated what happens in November. But just again, a political question of what you see in the horizon in terms of the federal government's role on all of the efforts related to COVID-19. So obviously we had the drama over the CDC guidelines as it relates to schools, that we had some, that we didn't have some, then they're revised. Now that there's this kind of push and encouragement towards reopening, obviously we're having some of these efforts. Obviously the Republicans and Democrats coming from different places, but as schools enter in the fall and actually start up, what do you think the sentiment is going to be? And especially as members start going back to their districts, and what do you see as the long-term prognosis on some of these issues?
Yeah, I think it's going to depend a lot on what happens to the virus over the next few months. I mean, what happens from today on out? Are we going to see cases continue to rise at really scary levels in some states? Are we going to see that start to, to flatten and then those cases to decline? What's going to happen in other states in the country? Places like the Northeast, where we've seen case declines over the last 3-4 months, to the point where there is some growing optimism about the possibilities for the fall. I think this is a California audience, and obviously things in California are not going so great right now compared to the rest of the country. But I think in terms of a national sentiment, the way that things are going in various different parts of the country is also going to play into that, particularly in terms of a federal response. I mean, I think, my guess is, beyond those conversations in Congress that are taking place right now, that is probably the most robust federal response we're going to get to this over the next, 3, 4, 5 months. I'm not sure, absent things getting significantly worse, that there is more of a federal role potentially in the offing, just because the administration has sort of scoped out what it wants its role to be in COVID-19, and it's very easy to debate the extent to which that's the correct position. I certainly have a very strong opinion on that, but at the same time, it sort of has been quite clear on what it wants its role to be, and that this is more of a states issue than it is a federal one. I don't necessarily see that changing all that much. I mean, we've had a bit of a potentially a bit of a different approach to the way the president has been approaching some of these issues around mask wearing and some of the public health guidance. The question will be, does that last, and does it translate into something more robust? And I just don't know.
We'll hit you with one last question here, and it's not going to be about how many legislative meetings you have had in just wearing a pair of basketball shorts. I'm going to ask you about the Washington football team.
Yes.
There's been a lot of discussion over the last few weeks about the change of the nickname, and then the football team has decided indeed they're going to change their nickname. Yep. It's been a national discussion, but Can you tell us, living in DC, what's the discussion like? Is there excitement about it, or is it not necessarily moving the needle as far as conversation?
You know, there is so much happening right now that, like, you know, with this 2-3 years ago, I'm sure it would be a much bigger conversation. I will also say the other issue is I just don't see very many people anymore. It's tough to take the public mood when the only person you see on a day-to-day basis is your Pittsburgh Steelers fan of a wife. I mean, personally, you know, Washington football team. I mean, is there no more appropriate name for the Washington football team, right? I mean, you know, it's the Washington DC based team, and we have to have committees and meetings and hearings upon hearings, and then a placeholder name before we can come up with an actual title for what to call our football team. So, you know, Washington football team works just as well for me as, you know, Washington continuing resolutions.
We should take
or anything like that.
We should take the European model. Why do we need a mascot per se? Yeah, let's just go with that, right?
Exactly. And I think too, yeah. So Washington football team, and let's call the mascot the Washington football mascot. I think that's perfectly appropriate.
Hey, Alex, before we let you go, is your pitch, if we take you out to a Nationals game, can you throw one better than Anthony Fauci did?
Well, since, as I'm sure you can tell from my accent, I'm not originally native to the US. Ask me that question about bowling a cricket ball, and I could give you a good answer.
Very good.
I'll plead the fifth when it comes to baseball.
Sounds good. Alex Perry, Foresight Law and Policy, our DC insider. Alex, thanks so much for being with us on the show. It was an honor to have you.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
All right, Edgar, as we move our way just past the bottom of the hour, a good summary of everything happening on the federal level. It just seems like there's so much going on, and these next few weeks are going to be just incredibly busy.
Yeah, I'm sure we will have more to report in the weeks to come. And so we're going to stay tuned both on what's happening here in Sacramento, but also across the country in our nation's capital.
Yeah. Edgar, good to see you again.
Always, Naj.
Maybe you'll be in your other studio next week, and you'll have guests come on.
Maybe I'll get creative and find another location. We'll see.
There you go. There you go. All right, Edgar, good to see you, folks. Thanks so much for being with us here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Remember, live and interactive every Wednesday, beginning at 1 p.m. here on ACSA Facebook and ACSA YouTube. Have a great rest of the week. We'll see you next week.